My name is Tokata Iron Eyes. I'm 16 years old. I'm from the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota. I currently live on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. My mother is Oglala Lakota and my dad is Hunkpapa. And he's originally from Standing Rock and she's from here in Pine Ridge. Standing Rock is where the Hunkpapas were allocated to, along with some of the Dakota. And so throughout this region of South Dakota and going up and towards North Dakota is where my family's from. We are at the site of the Wounded Knee Massacre in Wounded Knee, South Dakota. On December 29th, 1890, 300 plus men, women, and children were massacred here. And I come from the survivors of that massacre. We had ancestors. We had ancestors who were resisting, and those ancestors are now buried in a mass grave right behind us. It's actually a really crazy story because we wouldn't have survived as a family if it wasn't for one baby. And no one really knows how he survived the massacre because every other person who was with him, they died. And somehow he ended up being adopted into another family and they took care of him until he was older. And that's my great-great-grandfather now. The massacre happened because, well, the people who were killed here were the last of Sitting Bull's people. And he was one of the greatest chiefs that the Lakota people ever had. And he was also one of the strongest resistors of the American imposition upon our lands. So, in a way, revenge for his leadership and because of the battle at Greasy Grass where Custer was killed. This place was really the center of resistance for our people in the 1970s. In this revolutionary time of being able to finally stand up for ourselves and provide for ourselves again as a people. Because for so long we'd been entirely dependent on the government and we'd been beaten down as a culture and as a nation because they took away our right to pray like we've been taught and our right to really be Lakota. So this place marks a time of change in the ways of history in the 1800s and change in this way of strength in the 1970s. I consider the work that I do to protect the land a part of who I am as an Indigenous person, and I would say a part of my spirituality. It's just that I was taught to think of the earth as a relative, and so inherently it brings upon questioning of the ways in which we treat the earth now, which I guess could be considered activism in the world that we live in. Growing up here has been one of the hardest things about who I am and about my life, because here it's a daily question of why we have to live like this. And if you know a lot about the history like my family does, and if you're growing up learning that every day about the massacres and about the struggles that your ancestors went through, it really is a hardship to have to look back at those traumas every day. And because the rest of the world doesn't recognize those things yet, it's a really lonesome struggle. As Indigenous people, poverty is different because we were never introduced to a capitalist system the way that we were expected to integrate into it. So the ways in which our communities function, the cycles in which we used to have that were indigenous to us, those are gone or they're broken. And so they're not working the ways that they're supposed to because we're trying to implement them in a system that doesn't want it. It shows up in the ways that we treat each other now within our community and the way that we can't seem to lift each other up as much as we should be able to. I think of myself as a feminist simply by being an Indigenous woman in the world that I live in today, because I live in a time where my aunties and sisters go missing and are murdered around me. And so, as a person who loves those people, it would not make sense for me not to be inherently protective of them and want them to be safe and want myself to be safe. And I think that that's how I'm a feminist. I've also strived to make sure that the earth is safe, and I recognize her as a woman or as a feminine power. And so if I want to be able to say that I'm a feminist, I'm also inherently fighting for her rights. When extractive industries like the fossil fuel industry come into Indigenous communities, they're bringing with them a lot of danger, and it has created a real opportunity for violence, because these men who are brought here oftentimes end up hurting our women. They end up being raped or killed or kidnapped or sold. My aunt, actually, Olivia Lone Bear, she went missing and they didn't find her body until months later. And for those months, getting to know a woman that I hadn't ever really known personally as a headline in the news and as somebody who was just gone, I think that was really hard for me. And even now, we don't know what happened to her. So I still see her in my mind as a headline. So you grow up knowing to be cautious about those things, and you grow up knowing that there are people out there who want to hurt you in the first place. And I think those are things that are damaging for young women. My hopes for the future would one day be able to live here and bring, hopefully, my future children with me back to this place, and be able to look on it not as a place of sadness and hardship, but as a place of joy and prosperity. Because I know that the people who died for this land and for me to be able to be here would want that also. We are at the sacred site of Peshla, which in Lakota means bald spot, because in the middle of these hills that are covered in trees, except for this one spot that has very few trees on it, and you can see the way that the earth looks and the way that it would look if we could see beneath the trees that cover the hills. Peshla is in the middle of the Black Hills in South Dakota. The Black Hills are considered the heart of the world to the Lakota people. They're one of our most sacred sites in the entire world, and we've been coming here for generations. To me, sacred means that somebody has prayed or felt a connection to an object, a person, a place, or a thing. So if I feel really strongly about the way that the wind moves the grass, that's sacred to me. Or something as simple as the way that the sun feeds everything that it touches. I think that sacred just means that where life is present, it needs to be protected. The buffalo are one of the most sacred animals to us. Throughout millennia, we've used them as a life source for almost everything that we needed. And so as important as water or as the sun, the buffalo were also right there with them. And they were really a prominent part of our culture and still are. But when colonization and genocide came to this land, one of the first things that they did was wipe out the population of the buffalo so that we would starve and that we would lose that part of our culture. And so to be able to bring the buffalo back to this land and have them graze here and prosper here without any form of violence being threatened upon them is something that's really symbolic and also a real sign of resilience amongst Indigenous peoples. When I was about 8 years old, my mother and father made a petition to fundraise money to buy this land back from the people who had owned it. This is like the physical manifestation of the dreams of a 9-year-old and her family brought to life. I think it's also a really good portrayal of the ways in which that Indigenous peoples have been forced to participate in capitalism, because even to be able to regain this site that had been in our lives and in our culture for so long, we had to buy it back, which is in itself an insult to the way that we work as a people and the way that we believe in community and in each other, because that shows this side of thinking where we believe that we can possess our own land when in fact it's a life force of its own that cannot be possessed. A lot of times we talk about wanting to make change and really wanting to make these dreams that we all have for each other come true. And then still at the end of the day, we end up only curating solutions that involve us continuously participating in capitalism, which we know doesn't work. I also think that this place, as to be able to call this a safe haven away from the way that the world works outside of it, has also been really influential in my life. Just to be able to come here and see that there's not buildings taking up space where they're not needed, and that it's not congested with people all the time, is really beautiful for me. I think that humor played a really monumental role in me as a child in being able to look at the things around me as characters rather than objects, because my dad would always look at things and give them names or personality traits, and he still does it today with our cats and with objects around the house that would be considered inanimate. When you're a kid, that's the type of stuff that you pay attention to. And so it helps when you want to teach somebody really simplistically about the ways that we can look at the things around us as our relatives. My mom is a clinical director at the Indian Health Service on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And my dad is an attorney and public speaker for Indigenous issues. My parents, from a really young age, made sure that I knew my own history really well, the history of Indigenous peoples in the U.S., because they knew that I wasn't going to learn anything sufficient in school. And so they made sure that I knew who I was as an Indigenous person and what that meant. Within regards to my relationship with the earth and with nature, they always made sure that I was aware that everything had a life force within it. Everything has its own autonomy and its own free will. And so to be able to humanize the things around me as my relatives rather than something that I could own or take advantage of was something that was really monumental in becoming the activist that I am now. Because a lot of my work involves bringing awareness to that relationship, the relationship that human beings have with the earth. This relationship that is supposed to be nourishing and beautiful and loving. And right now, it's a relationship that's very abusive, and it's something that needs to be fixed. I didn't recognize the work that my dad was doing. I think him being in my life and being a leader in that regard, being in the home and telling me how important I was as a woman and the type of leadership that I carried inherently with that was always monumental in me feeling like I had the right to speak. And so I think a lot of times, whether or not you're doing something big in the outside world, the things that you're telling to your kids about themselves and the way that you model your compassion as an adult is what shapes young leaders. It's not how much notoriety you get from the people who don't know you. It's what kind of lessons you're going to teach the people who do. A couple days ago, my friend was talking about how she didn't know whether or not to consider herself a feminist because of the way that feminism looks to her. And I just talked to her about the way that people see feminism isn't how it has to be for her or how it has to be for anyone individually. I think that we all, as women, stand for different things because we are so different from each other. And that's a part of feminism, is being seen as individuals and being seen as different from each other. And I just started talking to her about the way that I'm a feminist, and the way that when I'm fighting for myself and when I'm fighting for my own rights and equality, I'm fighting in the same way for the earth as a woman. So I'm fighting for her rights and her equality and the things that she needs as well as the things that I need. And so there's many different paths to being a feminist, just like there's many different paths to finding out who you are. It's all about finding your space in this way of being. I would consider myself to be an Indigenous feminist because I think that the way that people view feminism now isn't representative of how I feel about being a woman and about what I need in regards to rights and equality. The most widespread and well-known form of feminism is white feminism. I think that white feminism comes from a place of wanting to prosper in a capitalistic system, in a system that we've already seen cooperates so well with patriarchy in regards to giving men more opportunities to be in leadership and to be able to continue the system. And so when white feminism wants to progress in that way, to be able to be in those same leadership positions, it's really progress made in the wrong direction because it's not inclusive of the women who have struggled within the lower classes for millennia, because those women are the ones who need this sort of representation the most. As an Indigenous person who has been living in a way that capitalism has been imposed upon my community for hundreds of years, I see that it's still not working and it's still not providing a way for me to learn about who I am as an Indigenous person and be able to really physically enact those teachings and that wisdom, because the two systems of being, this way of community versus this way of greed and selfishness, can't connect to each other in a way that isn't harmful or violent. This conflict between this world that we want to live in as Indigenous people and the one that we've been trying to grow in economically for hundreds of years, they don't mesh together. And so to be able to build a new system that encompasses the modern parts of this world and these ancient, important teachings of our ancestors, that's the kind of system that we need as humanity to be able to begin to really prosper as people with emotions, with feelings, and with dreams. Hamidakiapi, Chantewashteanape, Chiuzapi, Tokatumi, Ironize, Emachiapi, Namalako Chaje, Waniatui, Io Sloha, Ematahana, Waziahaha, Elwati. I said, hello everyone. I greet you as a relative with a warm heart and a handshake. My name is Tokata Ironize. My Lakota name is Waniatui. My name means future in the Lakota language. I'm from Standing Rock and I live in Pine Ridge. We are at Black Elk's Peak, or Hiha Kaha, in the Black Hills in South Dakota. One of the great Lakota medicine men or leaders, Black Elk, he came here in one of his visions of the future, specifically his vision of the next 7 generations. The vision also told of a tree of life. And for me, that tree has always represented Lakota people. And in his vision, this tree of life was dying. And it's almost always, in all of the translation of his vision, it never tells what happens to the tree. It talks about it blooming and dying again, like when leaves fall off of trees in the wintertime. And so I think it's really symbolic of the fact that we have a choice. We have the power to make sure that our tree stays alive. And our tree is dying right now. And so for me, this place has always symbolized hope. And it's always symbolized choice. And the fact that every day, every single choice we make affects this tree. And the tree can symbolize us as individuals, and it can symbolize the world around us. But we get to decide whether or not we live or die. The very first person to come here after we had initially signed the treaty that gave us the Black Hills was General George Custer. And Custer came here illegally and found gold, which is what started this huge escapade of greed to the west. And now we see the long-lasting effects of that trespass. This park is called Custer Park. And for a lot of people, he symbolizes a great leader and he symbolizes the American dream. For me, I grew up thinking of him as a monster. I grew up knowing that those who came here illegally and those who came to hurt us and to hurt the land, I knew that their intentions still resided here, even when I was really young. I used to have nightmares that Custer or someone who would have looked like him, in old clothes and long curly hair. I used to have dreams that he was eating me. He would cut into pieces of me while I was still awake and I could still feel everything, and he would eat parts of me right in front of me while I watched. And I told my dad about the dreams that I used to have when I was young about that, because it wasn't just a one-time dream. They were recurring dreams of this happening to me. And I told my dad about it for the first time a couple of years ago, and he told me that he thinks that my dreams represented colonization in a way. Because what colonization and genocide do is they come into a community and they take out the parts that are valuable to them. And they leave behind the rest. And they kill it in the process. The things that fit into their system of greed and their system of hurt, those are the things they keep. And the things that make us indigenous, the things that make us people, those are the things that they'll crush. Those are the things that they'll eat. Those are the things that they'll take away from us. For me, it's always been a really tough situation to have to pay to visit the Black Hills and to visit these sacred sites, because it's really a symbol of how in-depth colonization has rooted itself in our homelands, because now people don't even know the true stories of the places that are still here and the places that still hold such sacredness, they know it only as a tourist stop, or they only know it as a commodified version of other places around the world that don't hold as much power. Whereas for me, this is a place where my ancestors lived and prayed and died. And for me, it's really a haunting feeling to come here and not see that recognized by the people who have the audacity to come here. In the Black Hills in general, they've created this image of this place in their minds that says that they are allowed to take things from the earth, such as uranium and oil and gold and coal. And they've turned this into a place where they come only to take, when in reality, this place has been here far longer than any of us have been alive, and it deserves respect. It deserves the utmost respect that we can give it. And the fact that we see this as a place where we can come to hang out and spend our time and spend our breaks, rather than make this a place for research and education on Indigenous peoples and the people who were here before we decided to set up our amusement parks. It's also a dangerous time for the Indigenous peoples who come here to pray, or who come here to visit, because we're greeted with racism and we're greeted with discrimination often. So I would say either don't come at all or come with respect. Sometimes when I close my eyes, or even when I just think about it, I realize I don't think that I'm okay. It's because the things that I am forced to bear witness to are not okay. As a child in America, I have watched discrimination in action before I knew how to say that word. I've been called racial slurs before I even knew what they meant. And I have seen corruption in my schools and in my city. It's when my teachers leave for better paying jobs, and when our relatives leave because they can no longer bear to live here. I guess you could say it's because we don't live here. We survive. The dreams our ancestors had of a better future for our children rests in the palm of our hands, and yet we cannot seem to grasp it. I wonder if anyone else finds it hard to breathe the air here. Can they too feel the endless sense of longing and the mistaken sense of hope? The air here is thick with it, and still I wonder why I cannot breathe. I watch as my peers are shot in our schools, killed literally while learning how to live. I watch as our families are being torn apart. And I watch as we are massacred in the streets for the color of our skin. I watch as our mothers are assaulted on the trip home from work. And I watch as my sisters are raped by old men who have probably been assaulted themselves. I watch as my aunties go missing year after year. They are taking away my everything. How much longer until there is nothing left? I wish I could close my eyes and see flowers and sunlight and rainbows. I close my eyes and I am so struck by my own memories that I could choke. I feel like I live with a constant lump in my throat. I am always on the verge of tears, even at my happiest. The things I've seen, the things I know, the things I remember, they are still happening, and that is why I cannot breathe. I don't want to watch anymore. I will not watch anymore. I am going to help my people, even if it means I will never breathe easy. Today we are at the Badlands in South Dakota, also known as Makoshiche. We see a lot of commonalities between Indigenous issues and in issues of the oppressed. And so it's created this sort of bond of trauma throughout young people, I think especially, because we're all worrying about the same things now. So to be able to build these relationships throughout the nation, relationships that are meant to help rebuild this world and make sure that we're creating a future that provides what it needs to for everybody, and not just those at the forefront of the issue. I think that being an ally to Indigenous people is always going to be complicated because we've seen the relationship of mistrust and greed that has been formed between these two entities, the entity of Indigenous people and the way of life that we carry, and of this capitalistic people and their way of greed. And these two haven't mixed, and the only relationship that's ever been touched has been violent. And so allyship is always going to be complicated because now we've seen this turn from violence and harassment to white saviorship in our communities, where it's only the people who have assaulted us in the past can come and reconcile or help in any way. And it's not working because there is no such thing as reconciliation without action first, and that hasn't been done. So when we look at Indigenous communities and the only people who are providing assistance in any way are those who have committed the genocide, how can we work on building a relationship that's healthy and not dependent? I'm currently attending Red Cloud Indian School on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And for the past year, it's been kind of a really personal struggle for me to have to go there because it's an old boarding school. And since I was really little, my parents have been telling me stories of what their grandparents and what my grandparents had to go through. This was a stage in which they would come into our communities and steal our children. They kidnapped children right out of homes. Law enforcement would come and knock on your door, and if you weren't ready to hide, they would take away your kids right there. Usually they took them when they were around 4 or 5, and the kids wouldn't come back until they were around 20. If you spoke your Indigenous language or sang your Indigenous songs, you would be beaten or hurt or worse. So the purpose of the schools was to basically beat the identity of an Indigenous person out of them in order to assimilate them into white society. And now we see it in the ways that our language has been struggling to be kept alive, and we've seen it in the way that there's been such a decrease in those who have and are able to carry our ancestral knowledge and songs and prayers. For me, something that's always been a huge hope of mine is to be able to sing my Indigenous songs and speak my language with my grandma before she passes away, because I know that for her and her stories of boarding school, that it really still is an open wound within her. And so to be able to show her that that doesn't have to be a source of hurt for her anymore is something that's really important to me. And also, for me, it's just really powerful to see that there's been this surge of Indigenous children learning Lakota as their first language. And so it shows in some of our schools on the reservation now. There are children who are fluent. And so the hope is that one day I'll be able to teach my kids their own language first. Mia taia mawani e o ya te wa amawani chaya ho taia mawani e mia taia mawani e waluta wa awa uelo heyo mia taia mawani e o ya te wa amawani chaya ho taia mawani e mia taia mawani e waluta wa awa uelo hei mia taia mawani e o ya te wa amawani chaya ho taia mawani e mia taia mawani e waluta wa awa uelo hayo mia taia mawani e o ya te wa amawani chaya ho taia mawani e mia taia mawani e waluta wa awa uelo hayo mia taia mawani e o ya te wa amawani chaya ho taia mawani e mia taia mawani e waluta wa awa uelo hayo mia taia mawani e o ya te wa amawani chaya ho taia mawani e mia taia mawani e waluta wa awa uelo hayo Today we are at the Cheyenne River, which is a tributary of the Missouri River. The Missouri River is the river where the Standing Rock movement was started. The Missouri River is the river that I grew up going to. Ever since I was really small, my family has always gone there. And the Missouri River is the river that feeds the entire tribe. I grew up on that river. And the river, in a way, made me who I am because the movement was started because of it. In 2016, the Dakota Access Pipeline was proposed to be built underneath the Missouri River, which is the tribe's only water source. As a direct response to that threat, we took up resistance in a really physical form, in the form of an encampment on the land, in order to protect that land and the water next to it from the fossil fuel industry. The encampments lasted for around 8 months total, and the entire movement was started 3 years ago and continues on today. Something that was really meaningful to me about being there was the fact that the people who made up those camps came from everywhere. And a lot of them were Native peoples who have had conflicts before and decided to come together to stand for one message, which was to protect the water for the future generations. And then once the Native peoples united for one message, I think it opened up this circle of awareness to the outside world so that they felt welcome again to stand strong in that sort of message. Because right now we're living in a world where even something as simple as protecting the water and the land is considered taboo or wrong when in the face of money. And so I think it really opened up this huge opportunity for people to give gratitude to the land and own it as something that is important to them. During the Standing Rock movement, my main role as a young person was advocacy, because my parents didn't want me to get hurt physically on the front lines, but I knew that I still couldn't sit still and do nothing. So I decided that my role, the thing that I could do and partake in, was being able to spread the message. If you want a movement to grow, awareness is always key. And for me, that was something that was accessible to me because I didn't have the option to be scared of speaking up anymore. When the movement first started, I was 12 years old, and the way that I got started was by participating in a video that was sending out a call to action for people all over the globe to recognize what was happening. Not even to come to Standing Rock physically, but just to be aware and spread the word about the situation there, about the fact that a pipeline was proposed to be built underneath it and what that would mean for the people who were already living there. And from that first video, thousands upon thousands of people started coming and flooding into the land to be there with us in a physical form of resistance. My mom was the clinical director at the hospital at the time, and so being at the protest put her at risk every day of losing her job. But she decided that her job was lower on the list of priorities when it came to protecting the land and the water for her children. So every day she was out there on the front lines with the rest of our people. And one day when the trucks with all the equipment began to start building a road and a path for them to continuously use throughout their work, she decided that she was going to step in front of them. And when she did that, she got arrested. And I think her being able to do that as a woman in a position of power on the reservation sent this sort of ripple effect through the people to where this issue became serious now, because people were willing to lay their livelihoods on the ground for the water and for the future generations. And for me, that is what really gave me a sense of purpose, to know that I had to do something. It was no longer a choice after she got arrested because it meant too much. When somebody offers to sacrifice that much for you, there's a sort of balance that needs to be kept. Just like in the ways of which the earth gives us everything that we need, there's a balance that needs to be respected, and we're not doing our part. After my mom was arrested, I knew that it was a very real possibility that my dad could be arrested also. And I had seen people being hurt. There was a woman who got her arm blown off. There are several people who went blind because of the forceful tactics that law enforcement was using to stop and oppose us. And it was really scary for a time, and especially when my dad was arrested. He knew right off the bat that they were going to try to make an example out of him because he was a leader in the camps at the time. And I knew that there was a very real possibility that they were going to send him to prison, and I wasn't going to get to see him. He wasn't going to get to be my father in that time. At the height of the movement, there was 15,000 people there, all standing for the same thing and all standing there to protect the water. So it's the situation where you're seeing the world in which we could be living in, this world of unity and love and passion and gratitude for one another, and you're also seeing a very real conflict and very real violence that sort of disruption to the system creates, because people are willing to die to keep things the way that they are, even though the way that things are right now is killing us. I mean, I think Standing Rock made me grow up a lot more than I probably should have. Because when you're in these situations of conflict, and when you're in this situation of fighting constantly, you don't get to have a childhood because you have your purpose already. Children are meant to wait and grow and figure out what they want to do and who they want to be. But if you're fighting for something as simplistic as water and safety, those things turn you into an adult, because everybody should have those already. And you're not supposed to be worrying about it when you're a child. Standing Rock also gave me every single person that I have around me in my life right now. It's given me purpose, and it's giving me a path to follow in a world that seems so crazy. Because even in this crazy time of climate crisis, I know that there's an opportunity for real unity around the entire globe to unite against this. Even in the worst of times, there's going to be a possibility for something better, and it's going to be real, and all it takes is for us to do our part.